Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Fixed Customer.
I remember my first day at the coffee shop like it was yesterday. The moment I walked in, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee enveloped me, instantly making me feel at home. Nestled on the corner of Maple and Fifth, the shop had a cozy, inviting vibe that attracted a variety of customers. My shifts were typically quiet, filled with the soothing sounds of steaming milk and the gentle chatter of patrons. However, there was one customer who always seemed to stand out. Every day, right at 3 p.m., he would arrive without fail. The man was tall and thin, his long black coat flapping slightly as he pushed the door open. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, obscuring his features from view. I could never shake the eerie feeling he gave me. He would shuffle to the same corner table, order a black coffee, and sit there, his eyes scanning the room with an unsettling intensity. At first, I thought he was just another quirky regular, but as the days turned into weeks, my curiosity morphed into an unsettling dread. He never spoke to anyone, not the baristas, not the other customers, just observed. I often caught myself glancing over, trying to decipher what went on behind that inscrutable expression. It was as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to arrive. Something about the way he watched people sent shivers down my spine. It was hard to explain, but I felt like I was being studied, as if my every move was being recorded in his mind. I couldn't help but wonder what his story was, why he chose to spend his afternoons in a coffee shop, alone. As I wiped down tables and prepared drinks, I often found my thoughts drifting back to him. I wanted to understand what compelled him to return day after day. Was he searching for connection? Was he lost? My mind raced with questions, but each time I caught his eye, I quickly looked away, overwhelmed by an inexplicable fear. Then one afternoon, after weeks of watching him from a distance, I made a decision. I would break through the silence that surrounded him. I needed to know who he was and why he haunted that corner table like a ghost. With a nervous heart, I walked over, determined to reach out. Little did I know, I was about to uncover a truth that would change everything. As the clock struck 3 p.m., I felt my heart race in anticipation. Today was the day I would finally speak to him. I took a deep breath, pushing away the nervousness that tightened my chest. As I made my way through the bustling coffee shop, I focused on the familiar scent of coffee and pastries, trying to steady my nerves. He was there, just as I expected, sitting at his usual table in the corner. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow around him, yet he appeared to be enveloped in shadows. I approached slowly, my pulse quickening with each step. As I reached his table, I mustered a smile, hoping it would break the icy atmosphere between us. "Hi there. Can I get you anything else?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. He didn't respond, just continued to stare blankly at his coffee cup, which had long grown cold. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me, thick and heavy. My stomach churned with a mix of excitement and fear. "I'm new here. I've seen you come in every day," I continued, attempting to fill the silence with chatter. "You always order the same thing." Still, there was no response. It was as if I were talking to a statue, a part of the furniture rather than a living person. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and I turned to leave, but not before I noticed his gaze flicker toward the window. My heart skipped a beat. It was an odd, distant look, as if he were searching for something just beyond the glass. Is everything okay?" I asked hesitantly, my curiosity now tinged with concern. Suddenly, his gaze snapped back to me, and for a brief moment, I felt an unsettling connection. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to penetrate my very being. I shivered, feeling exposed, as if he could see straight through me. "Help," he whispered, his voice so faint I could barely hear it over the soft hum of the coffee shop. I blinked, stunned. Did I really just hear that? A chill ran down my spine as I took a step back. I could see the other customers milling about, oblivious to the surreal moment unfolding in that corner. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, but the need to understand pushed me to stay. "What do you need help with?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But he simply lowered his head, the brim of his hat casting shadows over his face again. I felt the heaviness of despair radiating from him. It was palpable, like a dark cloud enveloping the table. Confused and frightened, I backed away slowly. The moment felt strange, almost surreal. As I returned to the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. I glanced back at him, and for a moment, our eyes met again. His expression was vacant yet haunting, leaving me with a deep sense of unease that would linger long after my shift ended. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the mysterious man. I replayed our encounter over and over, trying to decipher the meaning behind his soft plea for help. His vacant stare haunted me, and I felt a strange compulsion to understand his story. What had driven him to sit in that coffee shop day after day, lost in his thoughts? The next morning, I decided to do a little digging. I arrived at the coffee shop earlier than usual, hoping to catch the man before the usual crowd arrived. I needed to find out more about him. I chatted with my coworkers, but they didn't seem to know much. They referred to him as the regular and shrugged off my concerns, insisting he was harmless. Just then, I spotted him entering the shop. My heart raced, and I felt a mix of dread and determination. I took a deep breath and made my way to him, this time ready to ask more pointed questions. "Hey, can I sit with you?" I asked, trying to mask my anxiety with a smile. He didn't respond, but he didn't object either. I settled into the chair across from him, attempting to appear casual. "I've noticed you've been coming here for a long time. Are you okay?" For a moment, he just stared at his coffee cup, his fingers trembling slightly around the handle. "It's not safe," he murmured, barely audible. "What do you mean?" I leaned closer, my curiosity piqued. "What's not safe?" He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and urgency. "They're always watching. You don't see them, but they see you. You have to be careful." The words sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's watching? What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing around the coffee shop as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. "The shadows," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They follow me. They want me to tell their story." "Shadows," I echoed, feeling a mix of disbelief and fascination. "What do you mean by that?" He leaned forward, and I could see the desperation etched on his face. "They come out at night. I thought they were just my imagination, but they're real. I saw one last week, right outside that window. It was watching me." My heart raced as I scanned the bustling cafe. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just people laughing, sipping their drinks, oblivious to the conversation unfolding at our table. "But you're here now. You're safe," I said, trying to reassure him. "No," he replied, shaking his head violently. "I shouldn't have come back. It's too late. They know I'm here." Fear coursed through me. "You have to leave then. Get out of here." But instead, he leaned back in his chair, a defeated expression washing over him. "It's already too late for me. But you can still escape. Don't let them see you. They'll find you too." I was frozen, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. I had entered this conversation seeking answers, but instead, I felt as if I were spiraling deeper into a nightmare. The cafe around us seemed to fade, the laughter and chatter dimming as his words resonated in my mind. "What do you mean by escape?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could utter another word, he froze. His eyes widened, staring at something over my shoulder. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the usual morning crowd. "Leave," he hissed suddenly, panic rising in his voice. "You have to go now. They're here." The urgency in his tone ignited a primal instinct within me. I jumped from my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Without a second thought, I bolted toward the exit, not looking back as I pushed through the door into the daylight. As I stepped outside, the warm sun hit my face, but it didn't dispel the chilling dread that clung to me like a shadow. I stumbled out of the coffee shop, my heart racing and my mind spinning with disbelief. I took a few shaky breaths, trying to process what had just happened. I felt like I had escaped from something dark and sinister, but part of me was still drawn to the mystery of that man. Who was he? What shadows was he talking about? As I walked down the street, I tried to shake off the fear that clung to me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man or something lurking in the shadows behind me. The sun shone brightly, yet the warmth did little to comfort me. I felt like I was living in two worlds, the vibrant daytime and the terrifying whispers of the night. Once I got home, I locked the door behind me and closed the curtains. I needed to feel safe, away from the prying eyes of whatever haunted that man. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, washing dishes, scrolling through my phone, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the words, "they're always watching," echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing moment. That night, as darkness enveloped the city, my anxiety intensified. The shadows in my apartment felt thicker, more menacing. I flipped through the channels on my TV, but nothing could distract me from the overwhelming sense of dread that loomed over me. As the clock struck midnight, I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring me peace. But sleep eluded me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't shake the image of that man's terrified face. Suddenly, the sound of a car horn blaring outside startled me. I bolted upright in bed, straining to hear. Was that just my imagination, or was something really out there? I got up, tiptoeing to the window to peek outside. The street was dimly lit, with only the occasional flicker of passing cars. But as I scanned the area, I noticed something, a shadow moving across the street, not cast by any object. It darted between the lampposts, fluid and unnatural, almost as if it were alive. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone, considering calling for help, but I hesitated. What could I possibly say? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Instead, I settled for dialing the coffee shop, desperate to speak to someone who might understand. As the phone rang, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Would anyone believe me? Would anyone care? Finally, I heard a voice on the other end, my coworker Sarah. "Hey, this is Sarah," she said, sounding cheerful despite the late hour. "Is everything okay?" "Sarah, it's me," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain this, but I think something is following me. I saw something outside my window, shadows that move on their own." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her frowning. "Are you serious? Maybe you just need to get some sleep." "No. You don't understand. It's real," I cried, my panic spilling over. "The man from the coffee shop, he said they're watching. He said I need to be careful." "Okay, just breathe," she said, her tone softening. "I know it's been a weird day, but it's probably just your imagination. Why don't you come back to the shop tomorrow morning? We'll figure this out together." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Please, just promise me you'll keep an eye out for the shadows." "Sure, I promise. Just try to relax." "I'll see you in the morning," she reassured me. I hung up, feeling slightly better but still uneasy. As I prepared to head back to bed, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window again. My breath hitched as I saw it. Dark, fleeting shapes slinking along the edges of the streetlights, watching. They were watching me. With my heart pounding, I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, desperate to shield myself from whatever horrors lurked outside. But the shadows still crept into my mind, whispering their secrets. I couldn't escape them, and I feared that I would soon discover their true nature. The sun barely peeked through the curtains as I jolted awake, my heart still racing from the events of the previous night. Sleep had offered no solace, filled only with nightmares of those lurking shadows. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the remnants of terror that clung to me. Today, I had to confront this madness head-on. After a quick shower, I made my way to the coffee shop, each step heavy with trepidation. The familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as I entered, but it felt different today, charged with an undercurrent of unease. I scanned the room for Sarah, my heart fluttering with a mix of hope and dread. "Hey!" Sarah called out from behind the counter, her smile brightening the dim shop. "You made it!" "Barely," I replied, forcing a smile in return. "Did you notice anything strange last night?" She furrowed her brow, shaking her head. "Just the usual crowd." "Why?" I hesitated, unsure of how to express my fears without sounding completely unhinged. I thought I saw something outside. Shadows, moving on their own. I can't shake the feeling they're watching us." "Okay, let's just keep an eye out today. We can't let fear dictate our lives," she said, trying to sound reassuring. As the morning unfolded, I attempted to focus on the customers, but my mind was consumed by paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in, watching my every move. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see those dark forms lurking in the periphery. Suddenly, the bell above the door chimed, and I turned to see a familiar figure enter, the mysterious man in the dark coat. My heart dropped. He walked straight to his usual table, a shadowy presence among the other patrons. "Sarah, it's him," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She followed my gaze, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Stay calm. Just serve him like normal." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I approached his table. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" He looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. "The usual," he said in a gravelly voice, sending chills down my spine. As I prepared his coffee, I felt a strange compulsion to ask him about the shadows. Do you know anything about what's outside? About the shadows? He studied me, his gaze penetrating. You shouldn't have come back, he replied cryptically. They're coming for you. My heart raced, and I nearly dropped the cup. What do you mean? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. They're always watching. They feed on fear. If you confront them, you'll learn the truth. But it may cost you everything. I stepped back, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I had to know, but the fear gripped me like a vice. I turned and walked away, serving other customers as I tried to shake off the feeling of dread. The hours dragged on, and the shadows outside grew longer as the day faded into evening. Customers began to leave, and the coffee shop emptied, but I felt an inexplicable pull to stay. Something was building inside me, a sense of urgency, a need to confront whatever was haunting me. Finally, as the last customer left, I turned to Sarah. I need to go outside and face them. I can't live in fear anymore. Are you sure? It's dark out there, and if what he said is true, she trailed off, concern evident in her eyes. I have to know, I insisted. I can't keep running from this. With a nod, she agreed to come with me. We stepped outside into the cool night air, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I felt the weight of those shadows creeping closer, but I held my ground. Show yourselves, I called out into the darkness, my voice trembling but resolute. I know you're there. Silence enveloped me, and for a moment I thought I'd lost my mind. But then, as if summoned by my challenge, the shadows began to take form, dark figures swirling and coiling around us, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I felt a chill seep into my bones as they surrounded us, their presence suffocating. But amidst the fear, a flicker of clarity emerged. I remembered the man's warning. They feed on fear. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to confront the shadows. I'm not afraid of you, I shouted, my voice stronger now. You have no power over me. The shadows writhed, their whispers turning to cries of frustration. I opened my eyes, and the figures began to dissipate, retreating into the darkness. As they vanished, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The night felt lighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe freely. I turned to Sarah, who wore a mixture of awe and disbelief. I can't believe you did that, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Neither can I replied, still shaking from the adrenaline. But I think it's finally over. As we walked back to the coffee shop, I felt a sense of closure, a realization that the shadows only held power if I let them. The man in the dark coat may have been a ghost of the past, but I was no longer bound by fear. I had faced the darkness, and in doing so, I had found my light.
Shadows on glass.
I never thought much about working the night shift at the coffee shop. It was a cozy little place in our quiet town, filled with the rich aroma of coffee beans and the gentle hum of chatter. But as the sun set and the last customer trickled out, the atmosphere shifted. The warm glow of the lights inside contrasted sharply with the darkness outside, making the glass windows seem like a barrier between two worlds. On one particularly still night, I was cleaning up the counter after a long day. The usual sounds of the coffee shop were replaced by an eerie silence that settled like a heavy blanket. I glanced outside, and my breath caught in my throat. The reflection in the glass showed the dimly lit street, but something was off. I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the window. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue. After all, I had been pulling late shifts for weeks. As I continued my routine, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned my back to the window and focused on wiping down the tables. That's when I heard it, a faint rustle. It sounded like someone was outside, but when I peeked through the glass, the street was empty. Just the dim streetlights flickering, casting shadows that danced in the night. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the hours passed, I noticed something strange. Customers had started to mention seeing things, too. One elderly man, a regular who always sat by the window, leaned in one evening and whispered, "You know, I see things out there at night. Figures, watching us." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I laughed it off. "You've been drinking too much coffee, Mr. Thompson. It's just the shadows." But that night, as I locked up, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The street was quiet, too quiet. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the shop, and for a split second, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure standing in the reflection of the glass. My heart raced, but when I turned around to look, there was nothing, just the empty street. I hurried to my car, the feeling of being watched crawling over my skin. I drove home, unable to shake the shadows from my mind. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The shadows would soon reveal their true nature, and I would be powerless to stop it. The next few nights passed in a haze of unease. Every time I walked into the coffee shop, the shadows outside felt thicker, as if they were waiting for me. The regular customers, including Mr. Thompson, continued to share their strange sightings. They described vague, dark figures lurking just beyond the glass, their shapes indistinct but undeniably present. It was unsettling to think that I wasn't the only one experiencing this. One evening, after a particularly quiet shift, I was organizing the pastry display when I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head, and there it was again, a shadowy figure standing just outside the window. My heart raced as I stared, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But no, it was there, still and silent, as if it were observing me. I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. "Maybe it's just a tree or something," I muttered, shaking my head. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. It was a tall figure, nearly indistinguishable from the darkness surrounding it, and it didn't move. That night, I decided to do some research on the coffee shop and the area. After closing, I scoured the internet, hoping to find some answers. The town had a rich history, and I stumbled across an article mentioning an old legend, stories of spirits that wandered the streets after dark, drawn to places of warmth and light. I brushed it off as nonsense. After all, who believed in ghost stories? But the more I read, the more the hairs on my arms stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were more than just tricks of the light. I started noticing patterns in my surroundings. The shadows seemed to follow me as I moved through the shop, their presence lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision. One night, Megan, my best friend, came to visit me during my shift. "You seem tense," she remarked, eyeing me as I wiped down the tables. "What's going on?" "Just weird stuff happening around here. Customers keep talking about seeing things outside," I confessed, glancing nervously at the windows. Megan laughed, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "You're not letting it get to you, are you? It's probably just the late-night vibe." We continued chatting, but I could feel my anxiety creeping back. Just as I was about to dismiss my worries again, I saw it. A tall shadow standing in the corner of the window. I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me, and I froze. "Megan, look!" I pointed toward the window, my voice trembling. She turned to see what I was gesturing at, but when she looked, the shadow was gone. "What?" "I don't see anything. It was right there. I swear." I could feel my heart racing in my chest, pounding against my rib cage. I turned back to the window, desperately trying to convince myself that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I watched the darkness outside. Was I really seeing things, or was there something sinister lurking just out of sight? As I stood there, anxiety coiling tightly in my stomach, I realized that the shadows were becoming more than just a fleeting thought. They were a looming threat that I couldn't ignore any longer. The next day, I found myself restless, consumed by curiosity and fear. I couldn't let the shadows dictate my life any longer. That evening, after the coffee shop closed, I decided to stay late, armed with a flashlight and a determination to uncover the truth. Megan had offered to come with me, but I felt it was something I needed to do alone. After all, if there really was something out there, I had to face it head-on. As the clock ticked past midnight, the coffee shop felt eerily quiet. The warm glow of the lights inside stood in stark contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. I turned off the music, letting the silence amplify the sounds of the street. A faint rustling, the distant echo of a car passing by. I set up my phone to record, hoping to capture any strange occurrences. I took a deep breath and approached the windows. My heart raced as I peered outside, scanning the shadows. "Just a trick of the light," I whispered to myself, trying to convince my racing mind. I waved my flashlight around, illuminating the street and the alleyways that branched off. That's when I noticed something unusual, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight in that direction, illuminating a figure standing by the shop's side entrance. It was tall and dark, but this time it was moving. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure paused for a moment, then darted behind the building, disappearing into the shadows. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I dashed outside, determined to confront whatever had been watching me. The night air was cold and sharp against my skin, and as I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. "Show yourself," I called out, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam danced over the ground and walls, but there was no sign of the figure. My heart sank as I stood alone in the stillness, wondering if I was losing my mind. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something on the ground near the alley, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, and as I unfolded it, my stomach twisted into knots. The words were hastily scrawled. "You're not safe here. They're watching." My hands trembled as I read the note over and over. Who had left this? Was it a prank, or was there something more sinister at play? I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the shadows around me felt thicker, as if they were closing in. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The note clutched tightly in my hand. I tried to steady my breathing. I had to find out more about the shadows, about who or what was watching me. I pulled out my phone and started searching for any mention of disturbances at the coffee shop or similar sightings in the area. As I scrolled through various forums and local news, I came across a thread discussing strange occurrences in our town. People reported seeing figures at night, shadows that seemed to follow them, and even a few who claimed to have had eerie encounters at local establishments. My heart raced as I read through the chilling accounts, realizing that I wasn't alone in my experience. The last post in the thread stopped me cold. It was dated just a few days before I started working the night shifts. If you see shadows in the coffee shop, don't ignore them. They know who you are. My blood ran cold as I realized that I had stumbled into something much darker than I had anticipated. The shadows weren't just figments of my imagination. They were a warning. But a warning about what? I needed answers, and I was determined to find them, no matter the cost. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of the note and the shadows that had begun to invade my life. The next day, I called in sick to work. I needed to gather my thoughts and formulate a plan. I couldn't just hide from the coffee shop and the creeping dread that enveloped it. I had to confront whatever dark force was at play. I spent hours researching local legends and historical accounts about the town, looking for clues that could explain the shadows. There had to be something, some reason behind their existence. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the stories became. Tales of a hidden cult that once operated in the area surfaced, people claiming that they'd been drawn to the darkness outside the coffee shop. Rumors of missing persons and strange rituals filled my screen, and I felt a chill crawling up my spine. That evening, I decided to return to the coffee shop, armed with the knowledge I had gathered. As I approached the familiar brick building, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the shadows were waiting for me to enter. Once inside, I was greeted by silence. I flipped on the lights and locked the door behind me, determined to investigate. I retraced my steps from the previous night, carefully scanning every corner of the shop. The shadows seemed to dance just out of reach, teasing me with their presence. I stood by the window, my heart pounding in my chest as I recalled the note I had found. "You're not safe here. They're watching." Who were they? I felt a shiver run down my spine as I peered into the darkened street. Suddenly, something moved in the reflection. No, not in the glass, but outside. My breath hitched as I turned my flashlight toward the source. Standing just beyond the shop was the same tall figure I had seen before, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the night, locking onto me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer to the glass, and the shadows seemed to elongate around it, swallowing the light. I stumbled backward, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My mind raced. Was this thing responsible for the notes? The disappearances? The dread that had settled over the coffee shop like a shroud? In a moment of clarity, I decided I needed to confront this shadow. I grabbed my phone and started recording, hoping to capture whatever was happening. As I aimed the camera outside, the figure began to dissolve into the darkness, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. Frantic, I rushed to the back of the shop, where I had stored some old supplies. I rifled through the boxes, searching for anything that could help me. That's when I stumbled upon an old ledger, filled with notes from previous owners. As I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. Strange occurrences reported in the evenings. Customers complain of shadows and whispers. The entry was dated decades ago. I couldn't believe it. This had been happening for years. I felt my heart race as I read on. The last line sent chills through me. "We must leave. The shadows are hungry for more." I slammed the book shut, realizing that I had to escape. But before I could make my way back to the front, I heard it, a soft tapping sound echoing through the shop. It was coming from the window. My stomach dropped as I turned to face the glass. As I looked outside, the figure was back, and it was closer than before, its outline clearer in the dim light. Panic surged through me as the shadows around it twisted and writhed like dark smoke. I turned to run, but the door was suddenly cold against my back, and I could feel the darkness closing in. I was trapped. Help! Someone help me! I screamed, my voice echoing in the empty shop. But the only answer was the sound of silence, thick and suffocating. The shadows pressed against me, and I knew I had to face whatever was out there or risk losing myself to the darkness forever. I felt a rush of terror as I realized I was not just trapped in the coffee shop. I was trapped in a nightmare. The tapping at the window intensified, rhythmic and insistent, as if something, or someone, was urging me to look. My breath quickened, and my mind raced with every terrifying thought I could muster. I had to confront this darkness. I had to know what it wanted. With a shaky hand, I reached for the door, but the shadows seemed to pulse and coil around me, tugging at my limbs, urging me to stay. I steeled my resolve and tore myself away from the suffocating darkness. I rushed toward the front window, determined to face the figure lurking just outside. As I approached, I could see it clearer now. Its features were indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. The air crackled with an energy that sent chills coursing down my spine. My heart raced as I grabbed the edge of the counter for support, feeling as if the floor might give way beneath me. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled, forcing the words out through trembling lips. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was silence, and the figure stood unmoving, the shadows swirling around it like a tempest. Then, it began to move, gliding toward the window with a fluidity that defied logic. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, ensnared by its dark allure. Suddenly, it stopped right at the glass. The world outside seemed to dim, the lights of the street fading into obscurity. The figure raised a hand, pressing its palm against the window, and my breath caught in my throat. A sense of dread washed over me as I felt a deep, primal fear. This wasn't just a shadow, it was something far more sinister. I mustered my courage and yelled, "What do you want from me?" To my shock, the figure responded, but not with words. Instead, a feeling surged through me, a wave of emotions that felt like memories I didn't recognize. Fear, sorrow, desperation. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as I grasped the magnitude of what I was experiencing. It was as if the shadow was sharing its pain with me, memories of lives lost, of darkness that had seeped into the very fabric of the coffee shop. In that moment, I understood. I was not its enemy. I was a vessel, a means to communicate. The shadows were not merely watching. They were seeking recognition, validation of their existence. But the fear lingered. What if I opened myself up to them? What would that mean for my sanity? I turned to the ledger, desperate for answers, skimming through the previous entries. I found another entry dated much later. We tried to appease them, but the darkness grows stronger. If you see them, do not engage. They will take what you cannot give. I glanced back at the figure, its expression shifting, almost pleading. It wanted something, but I could sense the malevolence lurking just beneath the surface. I didn't know what it would cost me if I reached out to it, but I couldn't simply ignore its existence. Gathering every ounce of courage I could muster, I stepped closer to the window. "I see you," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know you're there. You don't have to be alone." The shadows around the figure pulsated with intensity, and I felt a surge of energy pushing against the glass, testing my resolve. I closed my eyes, focusing on the warmth of the coffee shop, on the memories of laughter and connection. You don't have to be trapped here. You can move on. Please let go. As if my words triggered something within it, the figure's form began to shimmer and dissolve, fragments of darkness swirling away like smoke in the wind. I watched in awe and horror, feeling a heavy weight lift from my chest as the air around me grew lighter. Suddenly, the pressure released, and the shadows retreated into the corners of the room, no longer threatening but instead whispering soft, mournful echoes. The figure vanished entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing and tears streaming down my cheeks. I didn't know what had just happened, but I felt a profound sense of release. The shadows, once dark and menacing, were now just whispers of what had been. After that night, the coffee shop felt different. The shadows no longer taunted or watched. Instead, they felt like distant memories, remnants of stories that had finally been set free. I continued to work there, sharing my experience with customers who would listen, hoping to remind them that we are never truly alone in our darkness. The shadows may linger in the periphery, but sometimes understanding and compassion can shine a light even in the darkest corners of our lives.
The hidden note.
I had been coming to this coffee shop for months. It was my little escape, a quiet place in the heart of the city where I could sit for hours with a book or my laptop. The familiar hum of people chatting, the faint hiss of the espresso machine, it was comforting. Today seemed no different. I ordered my usual, found my favorite corner table, and opened the book I'd been reading. But as I turned one of the pages, a small piece of paper fell out and fluttered onto the table. My first thought was that it was some kind of receipt or a bookmark someone had left behind. Curious, I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, like it had been written in a hurry. And the message was short but chilling. If you're reading this, it's already too late. They know where you are. My heart skipped a beat. I read it again, trying to make sense of it. Was this some sort of prank? Who would write something like this and slip it into a random book? I looked around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. People were sitting at tables, reading, typing, or chatting like normal. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stuffed the note back into the book, my hands trembling slightly. Maybe it was a joke, left by the last person who had borrowed the book. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that was creeping over me. As I sipped my coffee, my eyes kept darting around the room. A woman at a nearby table caught my eye. Had she been looking at me? She quickly turned back to her phone. I dismissed it as paranoia. I had to be imagining things, right? But then it happened again. This time, it was a man seated near the window. I saw him glance in my direction for just a little too long. It's nothing, I told myself. People look around all the time. There's no reason to panic. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. And for the first time since I started coming to this coffee shop, I didn't feel safe. The next few days were strange. Every time I tried to forget about the note, it crept back into my mind. The words replayed in my head, a constant reminder that someone, somewhere, might know something about me that I didn't. Maybe it was nothing, but the more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. Despite my growing unease, I went back to the coffee shop. I told myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid, even. It was just a note. Nothing more. Still, I couldn't help but scan the room as I walked in. The same people were there. It was odd, now that I thought about it. Some of the faces were becoming too familiar, like they were always there, every single time. I took my usual seat, my book in hand, but I wasn't reading. I felt like I was being watched again. I tried to brush it off. It was all in my head. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone staring at me. A man at the far end of the room. His gaze was fixed on me, cold and calculating. He didn't even pretend to look away when I noticed. Instead, he kept watching, like he was waiting for something. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, pretending to focus on my book, but my skin prickled with the feeling of being observed. I decided to leave, my mind racing. As I gathered my things, I glanced around one last time. The man was still there, still staring. The next day, it happened again. A different person this time, a woman sitting near the counter. She kept glancing at me, then quickly looking away whenever I caught her. My heart pounded, and my hands felt clammy. Was I imagining it, or was I being followed? I started to notice little things that made me question everything. The barista, usually friendly and talkative, barely said a word to me anymore. He would just glance over at the other customers, as if they were silently communicating. It was subtle, but unmistakable. There was something off about the entire place now, something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. By the end of the week, I was on edge every time I entered the coffee shop. No matter where I sat, no matter who was around, it felt like all eyes were on me. It didn't make sense. I wasn't anyone special, just a regular person going about my day. So why did it feel like I was being hunted? My heart would race every time I pushed open the door, and I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see someone following me. The note. The damn note. They know where you are. Who were they? And why did I feel like they were closing in? I decided I had to stop going to the coffee shop. Whatever was happening there, it wasn't normal, and I needed distance to clear my head. Maybe I'd been imagining things. Maybe it was all just some elaborate prank, a coincidence even. But no matter how many excuses I tried to make, that deep, gnawing fear refused to let go. I skipped the coffee shop for the next few days, choosing to work from home or visit other spots across town. For a moment, it worked. The weight that had been sitting on my chest felt a little lighter, and the world seemed normal again. But it didn't last. The first time I saw the car, I didn't think much of it. It was just parked outside my apartment building. An old, dark sedan that looked like it had seen better days. I remember noticing the driver, sitting inside with the engine off, just waiting. But it wasn't until the next day, when I saw the same car parked in the same spot, that I started to feel uneasy again. On the third day, it was parked across the street from where I worked. I told myself it couldn't be the same car. There were thousands of old sedans around, and it was probably just a coincidence. But that little voice in the back of my mind wouldn't shut up. What if it was the same car? What if it was following me? I started paying more attention, and the more I looked, the more I saw. The car was always nearby, sometimes at a distance, sometimes close. At first, I couldn't see the driver clearly. The windows were tinted just enough to make it hard to tell who was inside. But on the fourth day, when the car followed me halfway across town, I got a glimpse of him. A man, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes. I could feel them on me. The feeling from the coffee shop, The weight of being watched, of being followed, was back, stronger than ever. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening, and I couldn't figure out why. I wasn't anyone special. I didn't owe anyone money. I didn't have enemies. But someone, or something, was after me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just overreacting. So I did what anyone would do. I went to the police. They took my statement, but I could tell they weren't taking me seriously. They said they'd keep an eye out for suspicious activity, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next day, the car was gone. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe it really had been nothing. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. The number was blocked. Hesitating, I answered. There was no voice on the other end, just a soft, steady breathing. My stomach dropped, and a chill ran down my spine. I hung up, heart racing. And then, it happened again the next night. Another blocked call. Another few seconds of breathing before the line went dead. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The car hadn't disappeared. It had just gotten closer. It wasn't parked down the street or across town anymore. Now it was parked right in front of my building. And whoever was in it, they knew where I lived. I barely slept that night. Every creak in my apartment made me jump. Every gust of wind outside my window sent chills through me. I kept the lights on, hoping that somehow they would keep me safe. But no matter how bright the room was, the darkness seemed to close in, pressing against me from every corner. By morning, I felt exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay locked up forever. I decided to go back to the coffee shop, hoping it would give me some sense of control. Maybe I could confront whoever had left that note, ask the baristas if they'd seen anyone suspicious, something. I needed answers. The moment I walked in, though, I knew something was wrong. The familiar comfort I used to feel was gone, replaced by a suffocating tension. I scanned the room, my heart pounding. There they were again, those same faces. The same people I'd seen weeks ago. Some of them sitting in the same spots, wearing the same expressions. But this time, there was something different in the way they looked at me. It wasn't just a glance anymore. It was like they were all in on something, something I wasn't a part of, something they were waiting for me to figure out. Their eyes followed me as I moved to the counter, every stare piercing through me like a knife. I forced myself to order a coffee, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. As the barista handed me the cup, she leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the others. I froze, gripping the cup tightly. "What do you mean?" But before she could answer, I heard the chime of the door behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slowly, my blood turning to ice. Standing in the doorway was the man from the car, the one who had been following me. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me with those same cold, predatory eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I needed to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The barista tugged on my sleeve, her voice urgent now. "Go out the back." "No." I didn't argue. I shoved the coffee onto the counter and bolted for the back door, my heart hammering in my chest. As I pushed through the door into the alley, I felt the cool air hit my face, but there was no relief. My mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. I needed to get home, lock myself in, and figure out my next move. But as I rounded the corner, something caught my eye. Tucked under the windshield wiper of my car was another note, just like the one I'd found in the book. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and unfolded it. This time, the message was even shorter, even more terrifying. "It's already too late." My hands trembled as I crumpled the note, glancing around the empty street. The feeling of being watched pressed in on me from all sides. I felt like a cornered animal, no escape, no way out. They weren't just watching anymore, they were closing in. I rushed to my apartment, locking every door and window, pulling the curtains tight. My phone rang again, that same blocked number. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the dark, curled up on the couch, my eyes darting to every shadow in the room. The phone rang again and again, each time more insistent. Finally, it stopped. Silence filled the room. I almost let myself relax. Almost. That's when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were slow at first, then stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. Whoever was out there, they were waiting for me. I crept to the door, peeking through the peephole, my blood turning cold. There, just like every night before, was a figure standing still in the hallway. Only this time, they weren't facing away. This time, they were staring straight at me, as if they knew I was watching. And in their hand, they held a note. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the peephole. The figure stood perfectly still, staring right at me through the tiny glass window, as if they could see me watching. My heart raced, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The note they were holding was pressed against the door, and even through the small circle of glass, I could make out the scrawled writing. Suddenly, they moved. The figure slowly bent down, slipping the note under the door, then straightened up, lingering for just a moment longer before turning and walking down the hallway, their footsteps fading into the distance. For what felt like hours, I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something, anything, but my body was frozen in place. Finally, with trembling hands, I reached down and picked up the note. The paper was crumpled and damp, the ink smudged, but the message was clear. "You were never alone. We've always been watching." The words blurred as panic flooded my mind. My apartment, my sanctuary, had they been inside all along? Was someone here right now, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down? My gaze darted around the room, every dark corner suddenly feeling sinister. The closet, the bathroom, under the bed. I grabbed a kitchen knife, moving slowly through my apartment, checking every hiding spot. But there was no one. The silence was deafening. I retreated to the living room, my back against the wall, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, the screen flashing with another blocked call. This time, I answered. I didn't speak. I just held the phone to my ear, listening, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. And then, a voice, low, distorted, and impossibly calm. "You can't hide from us. We've been with you from the beginning." I dropped the phone, my stomach twisting in fear. I was losing my mind. They were everywhere, watching my every move, tracking me from the coffee shop to my apartment, and there was no way to escape. But the worst part, the part that truly terrified me, was that they didn't want anything from me. They didn't need money, revenge, or anything I could offer. They just wanted to watch. The realization hit me like a freight train. Every time I thought I was alone, every moment I had felt safe, they had been there. They were in the coffee shop, on the streets, in the car parked outside, and now they were inside my home. This wasn't about stalking, it was about control. They wanted me to know they had been with me all along, and now they were closing in. I bolted to my front door, yanking it open and running down the hallway. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to get out. But as I stumbled into the stairwell, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the concrete steps. I looked up, and there he was. The man from the car, from the coffee shop, from my nightmares. He descended the stairs with a terrifying calmness, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I knew there was no escape. He was part of something bigger, something I couldn't understand. I turned and fled down the stairs, heart pounding, feet barely touching the ground. I burst through the door at the bottom, stumbling into the dark street, gasping for breath. But it was empty, silent. I looked back at the building, expecting him to follow, but he never came out. The streets were eerily quiet, no sign of life anywhere. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, desperate for any kind of shelter. I barely slept, my mind racing with paranoia. I kept expecting to hear a knock on the door, to find another note slipped under it, but the night passed in silence. The next morning, I tried to call the police again, but they dismissed my story, saying there was nothing they could do without concrete evidence. I couldn't even explain it clearly anymore. It sounded too crazy to be real. But as I left the motel and got into my car, I found one last note on my dashboard, tucked under the windshield wiper. "We'll always be watching." I stared at the note for a long time, my hands trembling, knowing it wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. They had been with me from the beginning, and now, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew one thing for certain: they would never stop watching.